The chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, casting a golden glow over the grand ballroom. Laughter and chatter filled the air as elegantly dressed guests clinked their champagne glasses in celebration. Tonight was supposed to be a momentous occasion, the engagement party of the millionaire's only daughter. The father stood at the center of the room, beaming with pride. His daughter, dressed in an expensive gown, stood beside him. The man she was supposed to marry, a wealthy businessman from an influential family, was waiting for the official announcement. Then, the room fell silent. "I won't do it," the daughter's voice rang out, loud and clear. Gasps echoed across the room. Murmurs spread like wildfire as all eyes turned toward her. The father's face hardened. "What did you just say?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I said, I won't do it," she repeated, her hands trembling. "I won't marry him." The businessman's face darkened with embarrassment, but the daughter didn't care. She turned to the guests and took a deep breath. "I love someone else." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The millionaire's face turned red. "You love someone else," he said slowly, his voice dangerously low. "Who?" The room grew tense. The daughter took a deep breath before she spoke. "A farmer," she said. Silence. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. Then, whispers erupted among the guests. Some gasped in shock. Others sneered. A few laughed, as if it were a joke. "A farmer," the father's voice boomed, cutting through the noise. His face twisted with rage. "Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying?" "I love him," she said firmly, standing her ground. "And I want to be with him, not for money or status, but because he treats me with kindness and respect. Because he makes me happy." Her father's fists clenched. "You think love is enough? You think happiness is enough? Let me tell you something. Money is what keeps people secure. Love fades. Wealth lasts. And you're willing to throw everything away for a man who can't even afford to give you a decent life?" The daughter held her head high. "Yes." The father's expression turned cold. "Then you are no daughter of mine." Gasps filled the room once more. "If you walk out of this house tonight," he continued, his voice unwavering, "I will cut you off. No money. No support. No family. You will be nothing to me." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to break. "Then so be it," she whispered. A shocked silence filled the room as she removed the expensive ring from her finger and placed it on the table. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Some guests watched in admiration. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But one thing was certain, her life would never be the same again. As she stepped out into the night, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She had lost everything, her wealth, her security, her family. But she had also gained something far greater. Freedom. Little did she know, the decision she made that night would set in motion a series of events that would change not only her life but her father's as well. And one day, he would regret every word he had spoken. The cold night air bit into her skin as she stepped out of the mansion, leaving behind the life she had known since birth. The streets outside felt unfamiliar, as if the world had suddenly changed in an instant. She had no luggage, no money, no plan, only a heart filled with love and a determination that would be tested in ways she never imagined. She didn't regret her choice. Not yet. She made her way to the countryside, where the farmer she loved lived. It was a journey that took hours, but she didn't feel the exhaustion. The moment she saw the small wooden house standing against the moonlit sky, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't grand like her father's mansion. It didn't have the luxury she was used to. But it was home. The farmer rushed out the moment he saw her approaching, concern etched on his face. He had begged her not to go against her father. He had warned her that leaving her wealthy life behind for him would not be easy. Yet, she had chosen him anyway. She smiled, though tears threatened to spill from her eyes. "I'm here," she whispered. He didn't question her decision. He simply opened his arms and held her close. But love wasn't enough to stop the storm that was about to come. The first few weeks felt like an adventure. She woke up to the sounds of birds instead of the clinking of silverware. She learned to cook over an open flame, carry buckets of water from the well, and clean clothes with her hands. It was difficult, but she found joy in the simplicity of it all. Then reality set in. Her hands, once soft and pampered, became rough and blistered. The dirt she used to avoid now clung to her skin no matter how hard she scrubbed. The meals she once enjoyed at her father's table were replaced by simple dishes, sometimes too little to satisfy their hunger. Her father had cut her off completely. She thought maybe, just maybe, he would change his mind after some time. Maybe he would soften and send her some help. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. There was no word from him. No messages, no money, nothing. She wasn't just disowned. She was erased. The villagers whispered about her. Some pitied her. Others mocked her, believing she would come crawling back to her father any day now. But she was determined to prove them wrong. She worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She learned how to plant and harvest crops, how to take care of the animals, how to survive with what little they had. And most importantly, she learned what true love meant. Her husband was nothing like the men she had met in high society. He never boasted, never used money or status to define himself. He valued hard work, honesty, and kindness. He stood by her through every struggle, through every tear-filled night. She found happiness in their small home, in the quiet moments they shared, in the way he looked at her with love even when she was covered in dirt. But love didn't pay the bills. Then the real hardship began. A brutal drought hit the region, destroying most of their crops. The little money they had saved was spent on food and water. The livestock suffered, and one by one, they were forced to sell their animals just to survive. The village was in crisis. Desperation set in as debts piled up. Merchants refused to give them credit. The land that once promised them a future was now their greatest burden. And then, the worst news came. Her husband fell sick. It started with a fever, nothing too alarming at first. But as the days passed, he grew weaker. His once strong hands trembled, his voice lost its strength. She tried everything, boiling herbs, fetching water, staying up all night to care for him. But nothing worked. He needed real medical attention. And that required money. Money she didn't have. The only option left was one she had sworn never to take, returning to the father who had cast her out. One evening, as her husband slept fitfully beside her, she made the hardest decision of her life. She wrapped herself in the one good shawl she had left and set off for the city. Her heart pounded as she stood outside the gates of her father's mansion. It had been years since she left, but the house remained the same, cold and imposing. She hesitated before knocking. A servant answered, eyes widening in shock. "You shouldn't be here," they whispered. "I need to see him," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. The servant hesitated before stepping aside. She walked into the house she once called home, but it no longer felt familiar. The air smelled of wealth, of excess, of everything she had left behind. Her father was sitting in his office, reviewing paperwork. He barely glanced up when she entered. She waited for some kind of reaction, anger, shock, maybe even relief. But there was nothing. Just a cold stare. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Her hands clenched into fists. "I need help," she said. "Help? He finally looked at her fully, studying her worn-out clothes, her thin frame, the exhaustion in her eyes. "I told you the day you walked out that you would regret it. Have you finally learned your lesson?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. She could beg if she had to. She could throw away her pride if it meant saving her husband. "My husband is sick," she said. "I just need some money to get him treated. After that, I'll never bother you again." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You chose your path," he said coldly. "You made your decision. Now live with it." Her chest tightened. "You're really going to let him die?" "I'm not letting anyone die," he said, his tone indifferent. "You knew what you were giving up when you walked away. Now, leave. I have nothing to offer you." She felt the walls closing in on her, the weight of desperation pressing down like never before. There was no more begging to do. Her father had truly abandoned her. Tears stung her eyes as she turned away. But deep inside, a fire had been lit. If her father wouldn't help her, she would help herself. No matter what it took, she would find a way. And one day, she would make him regret turning his back on her. The walk back to the village felt heavier than before. Each step was weighed down by exhaustion, heartbreak, and the brutal truth: her father had not changed. She had dared to hope, just for a moment, that perhaps he would see her suffering and remember that she was still his daughter. But no. He had turned his back on her completely. By the time she reached home, the sun was beginning to set. The small wooden house, which once seemed warm and welcoming, now looked fragile, as if it could collapse under the weight of their struggles. Her husband lay in bed, his breathing shallow. His once strong frame had become thin, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed. She sat beside him, forcing a smile. "I'll find a way," she whispered. He reached for her hand, squeezing it weakly. "You always do," he murmured. But she wasn't sure this time. The next morning, she went to the village center, looking for work. She had worked hard on the farm, but the drought had left most villagers struggling. Jobs were scarce. She went from house to house, offering to clean, cook, or do anything for a small wage. Some looked at her with pity, remembering that she had once been the daughter of a millionaire. Others turned her away without a second thought. At last, an elderly woman took pity on her and let her scrub floors in exchange for a meal. It wasn't money, but it was something. She worked until her hands were raw, then returned home and fed her husband, making sure he ate before she did. The pattern continued for days, working, searching, and barely scraping by. But it wasn't enough. Her husband's condition worsened. His fever burned through him like fire, leaving him weak and barely conscious. She knew she had to do something drastic. She had one last possession of value. A delicate gold bracelet, the only thing she had kept from her past life. It had been a gift from her mother, one of the few memories she had left of her. She hesitated, tracing the intricate design with her fingers. Selling it would mean letting go of one of the last pieces of her old life. But what was the point of holding on to memories if the man she loved was dying before her eyes? She took a deep breath and made her way to the marketplace. The pawnshop owner examined the bracelet with keen interest. "This is fine craftsmanship," he said, rubbing his chin. "I can give you a fair price for it." She nodded. "I just need enough for medicine and food." The man hesitated before handing her a pouch of coins. "Be careful," he warned. "The world is cruel to those who have nothing left." She took the money, bowing her head in thanks. She spent most of it on medicine, the rest on food and supplies. When she returned home, she administered the medicine carefully, praying it would be enough. For days, she nursed her husband back to health. She barely slept, barely ate, but she never stopped fighting for him. And finally, after weeks of struggle, his fever broke. She wept when he opened his eyes, clearer and stronger than before. "You saved me," he whispered. But the battle wasn't over yet. The drought continued, making survival even harder. Many villagers were forced to leave, searching for better opportunities in the city. Some turned to desperate measures, stealing, cheating, anything to get by. She refused to give up. She took on more jobs, worked harder than ever, and did whatever it took to keep them afloat. One day, as she was carrying a bundle of firewood, she overheard a conversation between two merchants. "They say a wealthy businessman is looking for people with land, willing to pay good money for it," one of them said. Her heart skipped a beat. They had land. It wasn't much, just a small patch that barely yielded enough crops. But it was land. That night, she sat by the fire, staring at the cracked wooden floor beneath her feet. If she sold the land, they could move. Start fresh. Find better opportunities. But if they left, they would be leaving behind everything they had worked for. She looked at her husband, who was finally gaining his strength back. He deserved a better life. They both did. The next morning, she made a decision. She found the merchant who was looking to buy land. The man was middle-aged, dressed in fine clothes, a stark contrast to the dust-covered villagers around him. She approached him, her chin held high. "I heard you're looking for land," she said. The man looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed by her appearance. "And what do you have to offer?" She described their small plot, the fertile soil beneath it, and the potential it held once the drought ended. The man smirked. "That land isn't worth much now. I could buy 10 like it for half the price." She swallowed her pride. "But it will be worth something when the rains return." He chuckled. "And why should I take that risk?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because I have no other choice." For a moment, he studied her. Then, without another word, he pulled out a bag of coins and tossed it on the table. "Take it or leave it." She didn't hesitate. The deal was done. And just like that, she was no longer a landowner. But she had one chance at a new beginning. With the money, she and her husband packed up what little they had and left the village. They traveled for days, searching for a place where they could start fresh. At last, they arrived at a small town known for its booming agricultural trade. It was here that her story would take a new turn. A turn no one, especially her father, could have ever expected. She had lost everything once. But this time, she would build something greater. Something that would change both their lives forever. The small town was nothing like the village they had left behind. The streets bustled with people, farmers, merchants, and traders, each moving with a sense of purpose. The scent of fresh produce filled the air, mixing with the rich aroma of spices and baked bread. She and her husband stood at the town's entrance, their belongings reduced to a small bundle of clothes and a handful of coins. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on them. "This is it," her husband said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Our fresh start." She nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. They had come here with nothing but hope. And hope alone wouldn't feed them. They needed a plan. Their first priority was finding shelter. They couldn't afford an inn, so they searched for temporary work. At the marketplace, she approached a fruit vendor and asked for a job. The man studied her rough hands, worn from years of farm work, and nodded. "You can start by cleaning up," he said. "I don't pay much, but it's better than starving." She didn't complain. For the next few days, she worked tirelessly, sweeping floors, arranging fruit, even carrying heavy crates. Her back ached, her fingers blistered, but she refused to stop. Meanwhile, her husband found work hauling sacks of grain at the mill. It wasn't much, but together, they earned enough to afford a small room on the outskirts of town. It was a shack, barely holding together, but it was theirs. She stood in the doorway that first night, staring at the cracked walls and the tiny cot. This wasn't where she had imagined herself years ago, standing in her father's mansion, surrounded by luxury. But she was free. And she still had one thing money couldn't buy: determination. Days turned into weeks. They worked harder than ever, taking whatever jobs they could find. She picked up skills she never imagined she would need: negotiating with merchants, handling finances, even managing produce. Her keen eye for quality didn't go unnoticed. One day, while sorting fruit at the stall, an elderly businessman watched her carefully. "You have a good sense for quality," he remarked. She looked up, startled. The man was well-dressed, but not flashy. There was something sharp about his eyes, as if he could see through people with a single glance. "I've worked on farms," she said simply. He nodded, considering. "I've been looking for someone like you," he said. "Someone who understands hard work and isn't afraid to get their hands dirty." She furrowed her brows. "For what?" "A new farming venture," he said. "Most people only think about selling produce. But I want to revolutionize the way we grow it." She listened carefully as he explained his plan: new irrigation techniques, advanced crop rotation, and most importantly, fair wages for farmers. Her heart pounded. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. But why her? The man must have seen her hesitation. He smiled. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said. "I built my business from nothing. And I see that same hunger in you." She hesitated. Was this too good to be true? But what choice did she have? She extended her hand. "I'm in," she said. And just like that, her life changed again. The next morning, she began her work under the businessman's guidance. She learned everything: how to analyze soil quality, how to maximize harvests, how to negotiate better deals. For the first time, she wasn't just working to survive. She was building something. Her husband joined her, eager to learn. Together, they poured every ounce of energy into the new venture. Months passed. The business grew. She soon became known among local farmers as a force to be reckoned with. Her knowledge, her leadership, and most of all, her resilience earned her respect. But the true turning point came when the businessman made her a partner. She had started as a laborer. Now, she was an owner. The girl who had once been disowned for marrying a farmer was now one of the most powerful figures in the agricultural trade. And her father had no idea. Then, something unexpected happened. One evening, while reviewing farm contracts, she came across a familiar name. Her father's company. Her breath caught in her throat. It seemed his business had fallen on hard times. The markets had shifted, and his once powerful empire was struggling. And now, he was looking for investors. Fate had come full circle. She closed the file, her hands trembling. The father who had abandoned her was now seeking help. And he had no idea that the person who held his future in her hands was the daughter he had cast aside. For the first time in years, she felt true power. Would she help him? Or would she let him taste the same suffering he had forced upon her? The decision wasn't easy. She stayed up that night, staring at the ceiling. Her husband noticed her distress. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated before handing him the file. His brows furrowed as he read. "This is your father's business." She nodded. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he sighed. "What are you going to do?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know." Her husband studied her carefully. "Do you still hate him?" She exhaled, realizing something. She didn't hate him. Not anymore. She had already won. She had built something without his help. She had proved him wrong. Revenge wouldn't change the past. But compassion might change the future. The next morning, she sent a message to her father's company. A formal offer, business only. No personal ties. No emotional weakness. If he accepted, he would be working for her. And for the first time, he would learn that money isn't the measure of success. The real test of wealth wasn't gold or status. It was character. And in that moment, she had more wealth than he had ever dreamed of. The letter was sent. She had crafted it carefully, professional, direct, devoid of emotion. The deal she offered was more than fair, but she made one thing clear: this was business, not family. Now, all she had to do was wait. For days, she received no response. She wasn't sure if he had ignored it or if the shock of realizing she was behind the offer had left him speechless. Then, on a quiet afternoon, a messenger arrived at her office. He handed her an envelope. The seal was unmistakable: her father's company. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. A simple, formal letter stared back at her. To whom it may concern, your proposal has been reviewed and accepted. A meeting is requested to finalize the agreement. Sincerely, her father's name, no acknowledgement of her identity. No personal words. Just business. She should have expected it. But part of her had hoped for more. She closed the letter, took a deep breath, and prepared for the meeting. The day arrived. She sat in the boardroom of a towering glass building, the headquarters of the company she had once been destined to inherit. The contrast was jarring. Years ago, she had walked these halls as a daughter, expected to be part of this empire by birthright. Now, she sat here as an outsider. But an outsider in control. The door opened. And there he was. Her father. Time had changed him. The once powerful man who had cast her out now had more lines on his face, more weight on his shoulders. His eyes landed on her, and for a moment, a flicker of something crossed his face: shock, maybe even regret. But he quickly masked it. "Shall we begin?" he said, his tone cool. She nodded. The negotiation started. He was still the same, sharp, ruthless, unwilling to show weakness. But so was she. She countered every argument with precision, dissected every number with skill, refused to let him have even a fraction of control. By the time the final papers were signed, it was clear, she had the upper hand. The company wasn't hers. But he was now financially tied to her, whether he liked it or not. She stood up, gathering her things. Her father remained seated, watching her. Finally, he spoke. "You've done well for yourself," he said. She met his gaze, searching for sincerity. Maybe there was a little. Or maybe he was just acknowledging that she was no longer the naive girl he had once dismissed. Either way, she had no words left for him. She gave him a polite nod and walked out. Back in her office, she exhaled deeply. It was over. But somehow, it didn't feel like a victory. Her husband walked in, sensing her thoughts. "How was it?" She shrugged. "Fine. It's done." He studied her. "And how do you feel?" She hesitated before answering. "I thought I wanted this," she admitted. "To prove him wrong. To show him that I didn't need him." Her husband sat beside her. "And now?" She sighed. "Now, I just feel empty." Because the truth was, revenge wasn't as satisfying as she had imagined. She had won. But what had she really gained? Her father was still just as distant. Just as cold. And deep down, she realized, what she had wanted all along wasn't revenge. It was acknowledgement. A real father. But maybe that was something she would never have. As the weeks passed, she buried herself in work. Her company flourished, expanding beyond farming. They invested in new agricultural technologies, sustainable methods, and small farms, changing the industry. Soon, people weren't just talking about her as a successful farmer. They were calling her a visionary. Newspapers featured her. Magazines wrote about her rise from poverty. Investors lined up to be part of her success. And eventually, the thing she never thought would happen, happened. Her father's company fell behind. While she innovated, his empire remained stuck in outdated methods. His profits shrank. His board grew restless. The empire he had built with arrogance was crumbling. And for the first time, he was the one in need. One evening, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, her father stood there. It was the first time he had come to her, not as a businessman. Not as an opponent. But as a man who had lost. He looked different now. Not just older, but tired. She crossed her arms. "What do you want?" He hesitated before answering. "I need your help," he said at last. For years, she had imagined this moment. Dreamed about it. But now that it was here, she didn't feel triumph. She felt sadness. Because this was never how it was supposed to be. She sighed, stepping aside. "Come in," she said. And that night, for the first time in years, they sat across from each other, not as rivals, but as father and daughter. And maybe, just maybe, there was still something left to salvage. She watched as her father stepped into her office, his presence not as commanding as it once was. His once confident gait had softened, his shoulders slightly hunched. He wasn't the same man who had cast her out years ago. But the question remained, was it humility or desperation that had brought him here? She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit." He hesitated before lowering himself into the seat, clearing his throat as if unsure how to begin. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to be the one to break it. Finally, he exhaled deeply. "You already know why I'm here." She leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Do I?" His jaw tightened. "I wouldn't have come if I had any other choice." There it was. The admission. The mighty millionaire, the man who once told her she would come crawling back, was now sitting before her, seeking her help. Her fingers drummed against the desk. "You need me." His pride made him hesitate before answering, but when he did, it was quiet. "Yes." She studied him carefully. This wasn't the arrogant man who had turned his back on her. He had lost something, not just wealth, but power. Stability. Maybe even a sense of self. And yet, something inside her still burned. "Why should I help you?" she asked. "You had a choice once, too." His gaze darkened, but instead of anger, there was something else, regret. "Because I was wrong," he admitted. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years preparing for this moment. Dreaming of hearing him say those words. But now that they had been spoken, they didn't bring the satisfaction she had imagined. They just made her feel tired. She leaned forward, folding her hands. "What exactly do you need from me?" His shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, she saw his pride rear its head again. The old version of him, the man who never asked for help, still lingered beneath the surface. But desperation is a powerful thing. "My company is failing," he admitted, voice low. "The market has changed. Our methods, they don't work anymore." She nodded. "I know." His lips pressed into a thin line. "And I also know that you've built something impressive." She raised an eyebrow. "Impressive?" A flicker of something crossed his face. "More than that," he admitted reluctantly. "You've done what I never expected. What I never believed you could do." The words should have felt like a victory. But she wasn't sure they did. Still, she stayed composed. And now you want me to save you. His fingers curled against his knee. I want a partnership, he corrected. Something mutually beneficial. She smirked. And what exactly do you have to offer me? From what I can see, your business is sinking. Partnering with you would be more of a liability than an advantage. His eyes darkened. I still have influence. She tilted her head. Influence? I know the market. I know the players. I may not have adapted the way you did, but I can still help you grow. She considered his words. On paper, it wasn't a terrible idea. But this wasn't just business. This was personal. She exhaled, standing from her chair and walking to the window. The view of the farmland stretched before her, a stark contrast to the glass towers of the city where she had once lived. It was proof of everything she had built. Everything she had done without him. She turned back to face him. If I agree to this, what does it mean for us? He blinked, as if not expecting the question. For us? She crossed her arms. Are we just business partners? Or are you finally acknowledging that I'm your daughter? He hesitated. The room was too quiet. And that hesitation spoke volumes. Her stomach twisted. Even now, even after all of this, he still couldn't say it. He was here because he needed her. Not because he wanted her back. Her voice was steadier than she felt when she spoke again. That's what I thought. He opened his mouth, but she shook her head. No. You don't get to talk your way out of this one. She walked back to her desk and sat down. I'll think about your offer, she said, her tone all business. I'll have my people review the details. But I need time. Her father's face tightened, but he nodded. Understood. She stood, signaling the conversation was over. You can see yourself out. He hesitated, as if wanting to say something else. But in the end, he simply stood and walked out. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, she let out a shaky breath. Why did it still hurt? The next few days were filled with silence. She reviewed the financials of his company. Her business advisors were skeptical, and rightfully so. His company was outdated, struggling, on the verge of collapse. A bad investment. But was that what this was? Just a financial decision? Or something deeper? Her husband found her late one night, staring at the documents. He set down a cup of tea beside her. You're thinking about it too much. She sighed. It's not just business. He nodded. I know. She looked up at him. If it were you, what would you do? He thought for a moment before answering. I'd ask myself what I really want. Do you want to help him out of obligation? Or do you want something more? She swallowed hard. I don't know any more. Her husband gave her a small smile. Then that's your answer. If you don't know, then you're not ready to make a decision. She exhaled. You're right. For years, she had thought she was seeking revenge. But now, she realized she was seeking something else. Something she might never get. A week later, she made her decision. She sent a letter to her father's office, just as formal as the one he had sent her. To her father's name, I've reviewed the details of your company. While there is potential, the risks outweigh the benefits. As such, I have decided to decline your offer. However, I am open to discussing alternative solutions. Not as business partners. But as family. The decision is yours. Sincerely, her name. She stared at the letter for a long time before sending it. She knew what it meant. It meant she was leaving the door open. It meant she was offering him one last chance. Not to save his company. But to save their relationship. And now, all she could do was wait. The letter was sent. For the first time in years, the power was in her hands, not in a way that sought revenge or dominance, but in a way that tested what truly mattered. Would he choose pride? Or would he choose family? She waited for days. The response didn't come. Her business continued to flourish, her schedule filled with meetings, expansions, and innovations. But through it all, there was an unshakable weight in her chest. Had she made a mistake? Had she been foolish to believe that, after all these years, he could change? Her husband noticed her quiet moments, the way she lingered near the window as if expecting something. One evening, as they sat on their small but comfortable porch, he finally said, "What are you going to do if he never responds?" She exhaled, gripping her teacup a little tighter. "Then I'll move on." But even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure if they were true. Because deep down, she was still that girl who had longed for her father's love. 2 weeks passed. Then, on a cold, early morning, a letter arrived. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her heart pounded as she unfolded the paper, but before she could read, she hesitated. Was she ready for what it would say? What if it was another rejection? What if it was worse? What if it was indifference? Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to read. "To my daughter, I have read your letter many times, each time with a heaviness I cannot describe. I do not deserve your kindness. I do not deserve your offer. I was wrong. Not just about business. About everything. I thought I knew what was best. I thought success could only be measured in wealth, in power. But you proved me wrong. You have built something greater than I ever could. And it is not just your business that impresses me, it is you. You became strong without my help. You thrived despite me, not because of me. And that is my greatest shame. You gave me a choice. And for the first time in my life, I want to make the right one. Not as a businessman. Not as a desperate man looking for rescue. But as a father. If you are willing. I would like to see you. Not in an office. Not in a boardroom. Just, as a father seeing his daughter. If it is too late, I will understand. But I hope it is not. Your father." Her hands trembled as she lowered the letter. A lump formed in her throat. She had prepared for every outcome. Anger. Indifference. Another cold rejection. But not this. Not remorse. Not a real attempt at change. She swallowed hard, staring at the words over and over. Was it possible? Could a man like him truly change? Her husband came up behind her, reading the letter over her shoulder. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, he asked, "What do you want to do?" She exhaled slowly. "I don't know." He smiled softly. "Then maybe you already do." Because if she truly wanted nothing to do with him, she wouldn't be hesitating. She would have burned the letter and walked away. But she hadn't. Because part of her still wanted to believe. A week later, she traveled back to the city. But this time, she wasn't going to a boardroom. She had sent a response, a simple time and place. And now, she sat at a quiet cafe, waiting. She didn't know what she expected. Would he actually show up? Had she just made a fool of herself? The minutes dragged on. Then, just when doubt started creeping in, the door opened. And there he was. Her father. He looked different. Not just older. But humbled. For the first time, she didn't see the powerful, untouchable businessman. She saw a man who had lost too much. A man who finally understood what really mattered. He hesitated, as if uncertain whether she would truly welcome him. She could have made him wait. Could have let him suffer in his discomfort. But that wasn't who she was. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit." He did. And for the first time in years, they sat together, not as enemies. Not as competitors. But as father and daughter. The conversation wasn't easy. He struggled to say the words, and she struggled to believe them. But slowly, piece by piece, he told her everything. How he had realized too late what truly mattered. How pride had kept him from reaching out sooner. How fear had made him push her away instead of accepting her choices. And most of all, how much he regretted it. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But I was only protecting my own ego." She let his words settle. She could have unleashed years of pain. Could have demanded he make up for all the lost time. But instead, she said, "I know." And for the first time, his eyes softened. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I'd like a chance. If you'll let me." She studied him carefully. Would it be easy? No. Would it ever be the same? Probably not. But maybe. Just maybe. There was still something left to salvage. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "Okay." Her father exhaled, as if the weight of the world had just been lifted from his shoulders. They sat in silence for a moment. Then, cautiously, he asked, "Tell me about your work." And for the first time, she told him. Not as an enemy. Not as a competitor. But as a father who finally wanted to listen. The life lesson. As she left the cafe that evening, she realized something. She had spent so many years chasing something she thought she wanted: revenge, validation, power. But in the end, the greatest victory wasn't in proving him wrong. It was in showing him that true success isn't measured in wealth. It's measured in who we choose to be. She had chosen love. She had chosen compassion. And that was the greatest success of all. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, her husband was waiting for her. He raised an eyebrow. "How was it?" She smiled, something lighter in her chest. "Unexpected." He took her hand. "Good unexpected?" She exhaled, looking up at the stars. "Yes," she said softly. "Good." And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace.